Today's video features the most insane Karen deaths ever recorded. From a woman so convinced she understood construction work better than the crew that she picked up their equipment to prove it, to another who turned her own mother's funeral into a battle that ended horrifically. It was April 18, 2016, at a public pickleball court in Mesa, Arizona. Several regular players had arrived that morning for their usual games. The courts were open to everyone, and a small crowd had already gathered around the playing area. Among them was a woman many players recognized because disputes seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her name was Elena Ridge, a 58-year-old administrative assistant. She spent most mornings at the courts and had become known for acting as though she managed them. Years earlier, she created a laminated sign-up sheet and encouraged players to use it before entering a court. Although it had no official approval, many newcomers followed it because they assumed she had authority. Over time, she added more rules and regularly told people when they could play and how long they could stay. Not everyone accepted her role. Some longtime players had grown frustrated with her constant involvement in matters that did not concern her. Elena, however, continued treating the courts as though they needed her supervision. That morning, a group of retirees arrived for a standing game they had played together for years. Elena approached them and informed them they could not use the court because they had not signed her sheet. The group reminded her that the courts were public and that her schedule was not official. They entered the court anyway and began preparing for their game. Instead of walking away, Elena followed them onto the playing surface. She continued arguing and insisted that she would personally settle the dispute. The disagreement attracted attention from nearby players and spectators. Since similar confrontations had happened before, several people began recording with their phones. Elena moved toward the center of the court and refused to leave. Players repeatedly asked her to step aside so they could begin. She remained in place and continued explaining why everyone should follow her rules. Several minutes passed without progress. Some players tried speaking with her calmly. Others suggested contacting park staff. Honestly, it was probably the smartest thing anyone said that day. By that point, the argument had already gone much further than it ever needed to. While waiting for the staff, several players on the far side of the court exchanged soft warm-up shots. They stayed well away from Elena and continued asking her to move. She refused and held her position near the middle of the court. During one exchange, a returned ball unexpectedly traveled toward her location. The ball struck the side of her head. Witnesses later reported that she appeared startled and immediately turned while taking several quick steps backward. As she moved, she failed to notice the lower cord attached to the net. Her foot caught the cord. She lost her balance and fell backward onto the hard court surface, striking the back of her head. Players immediately stopped and rushed to help while others called emergency services. There are so many moments in this story where Elena could have simply stepped away. I keep thinking about how different the outcome might have been if she had decided that proving a point wasn't worth the fight. Emergency responders transported Elena to a hospital, but she later died from her injuries. And just like that, what had been a dispute over a pickleball court turned into a fatal emergency in a matter of seconds. The investigation determined that the ball strike startled Elena, causing her to move backward and become tangled in the net cord. Authorities concluded that the fatal injury resulted from the back of her head striking the court surface during the fall. No wrongdoing was found by any of the other players. It was July 18th, 2017, in Destin, Florida. A busy seafood restaurant was packed with the lunch crowd as servers hurried between tables carrying whole grilled fish. One of the diner was Linda Joanne Marlowe, 66 years old, walked in. After 31 years of adjusting insurance claims in Knoxville, Tennessee, she had developed that special kind of arrogance where you think you're smarter than everyone else in the room. Her friends describe her as the type who would find a flaw in a perfect sunset. She treated every restaurant like a hostile witness in a courtroom, running 4 review accounts online and live tweeting her disdain from the table. I've met people like this, and they are absolutely exhausting to be around. The Marlowes ordered whole grilled red snapper. Now, the server gave them a fair warning. He told them the dorsal and pin bones in a whole fish were long, thin, and notoriously easy to miss. He even offered to debone it tableside. However, Linda didn't even look up from the menu and just flatly declined, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, announcing that deboning your own fish was what tourists did. She even pointed at a family nearby who had ordered fillets, loudly declaring they were eating them wrong. The cook even popped his head out, trying to be helpful, urging them to slow down and check every bite. Linda just picked up her fork, dismissively. You really have to wonder why people refuse help just to prove a point, right? She started tearing into that fish, talking non-stop, not even looking at her food as she shoveled it in. I've seen some oblivious diners, but this was something else. She was mid-sentence when she just stopped. A bone, about 4 centimeters long, thin as a sewing needle, had jammed itself deep into her throat. The server saw her freeze, realized instantly what happened, and reached for the phone. But Linda? She held up a hand to stop him. She reached over, grabbed a dinner roll, and forced 3 big bites down in a desperate, frantic rush. It is a common folk remedy, and it is a terrible idea. Seriously, folks, don't ever do this. You're basically just building a tomb for the bone. All she did was compress the bread around the bone, shoving it deeper and laterally into her throat. She started coughing, and blood splattered across the tablecloth. Her husband jumped up. The server was already dialing, but it was chaos. Within 2 minutes, her neck was visibly swelling as blood pooled around her airway. She couldn't speak. She just slid out of her chair. People scrambled. A woman nearby held her hand until the paramedics arrived at 12:53. But the obstruction was stuck deep in the parapharyngeal tissue. She couldn't breathe. That was it. She died from oxygen deprivation. It's absolutely tragic how quickly a meal can turn into a nightmare. The medical examiner ruled it accidental. The security footage? It showed the staff trying to intervene at least 3 times before she even swallowed that bread. No one was held liable. Her husband actually requested that the restaurant add a deboning advisory to the menu, and they did. And her phone? It was still on the table, right next to her plate. The draft review she was writing was still open. The first sentence? These people do not even know how to serve real fish. Talk about a final ironic sting. It is a grim reminder that no matter how much you think you know, the world, or in this case, a tiny piece of bone, always has a way of silencing you. It was July 4th, 2017. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, dozens of competitors gathered at the annual Independence Day BBQ Championship as crowds moved between smokers and judges sampled entries. Like every year, local bragging rights mattered almost as much as the trophy. Paula Jennings was 52 years old and absolutely loved barbecue. She'd spent years winning local competitions, eventually turning that success into a catering business. After hearing people rave about her barbecue for so long, she didn't just take it as a compliment anymore. She took it as a fact. Even before the judging began, Paula joked that they might as well engrave her name on the trophy now. She spent the morning handing out advice nobody asked for and critiquing other people's barbecue like she'd been appointed head judge. Late that morning, one of the neighboring teams began drawing an unusually large crowd. Their homemade bourbon barbecue sauce quickly became one of the most talked about entries at the event, with spectators lining up for samples while several judges spent longer at their station than Paula thought they should. Let's just say Paula wasn't exactly thrilled that someone else was getting all the attention. Unfortunately, I wasn't wrong. Paula walked past their preparation table, brushed against it, and sent the container of sauce crashing onto the ground. She immediately claimed it was an accident, but nobody nearby seemed to buy it. The team managed to keep competing, though most of the sauce they'd spent days making was gone. That little stunt didn't end up helping Paula nearly as much as she thought it would. Meanwhile, Paula had another problem. Hoping to impress the judges, she'd entered an unusually large brisket that was taking longer than she'd expected to finish. As the judging window approached, she decided there wasn't enough time to wait. Rather than let it cook through properly, she sliced into it anyway and submitted it as it was. The gamble backfired almost immediately. When the judges cut into the center, they found portions of the brisket were still undercooked. Under competition food safety rules, her entry was disqualified on the spot. Watching the neighboring team she'd tried to sabotage continue receiving praise while her own entry was removed from consideration only made Paula angrier. Witnesses said she argued with event staff for several minutes before storming back to her cooking station as contestants began shutting down for the afternoon. Event volunteers had already started closing the cooking area and instructed everyone to leave the propane equipment alone, while staff disconnected and inspected each cooking station one at a time. Paula ignored them. Convinced her grill hadn't been getting enough gas all afternoon and had cost her the competition, she insisted she'd fix it herself. Paula disconnected the propane cylinder and reattached it despite repeated warnings to leave it alone. The connection wasn't fully tightened, allowing propane to escape around the fitting. As nearby staff shouted that they could smell gas, Paula repeatedly tried to relight the burner, waving them off and insisting she knew exactly what she was doing. On the final attempt, the accumulated propane ignited in a sudden flash fire. Paula was leaning directly over the grill when the gas ignited, taking the full force of the fireball. The flames also ignited parts of her clothing before nearby competitors rushed in with fire extinguishers. They managed to put the fire out within seconds while someone called emergency services. Paula suffered severe burns across much of her upper body and was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite emergency treatment, she died from complications related to her injuries later that evening. Fire investigators later found no evidence that the grill or propane equipment had malfunctioned. Their report concluded the fire most likely began after propane escaped from a connection that had been handled during shutdown. Witness statements from competitors and event staff all pointed to the same conclusion. Paula had been instructed not to disconnect or reconnect the propane equipment herself, but chose to do so anyway. Her death was ruled accidental. The neighboring team, whose barbecue sauce Paula had tried to sabotage, went on to win the championship, while Paula's entry remained disqualified for failing the competition's food safety standards. It was October 21st, 2021, in Bellevue, Washington. A strong storm had settled over the area that afternoon. Rain fell steadily across a shopping center parking lot, and water had begun collecting around the electric vehicle charging stations near the entrance. Among the drivers that day was 48-year-old Audrey Gibbons. She worked in sales and was known for being confrontational whenever she felt she had been treated unfairly. Friends said she rarely let disputes go, often challenging people over customer service issues, parking spaces, or public rules. That afternoon, she arrived at the shopping center to charge her luxury electric vehicle while she visited a few stores. The charging area was busy, with nearly every station occupied. Audrey plugged in her vehicle and headed inside. While she was shopping, a problem developed at her charger. Earlier that week, a vehicle had damaged one of the charging units, cracking part of the connector assembly and compromising a protective seal. The charger had been taken out of service and disabled, but investigators later found that stormwater had entered the damaged housing. Combined with an internal electrical fault, parts of the connector remained energized despite multiple safety systems. As the storm intensified, a fault occurred, and Audrey's charging session automatically stopped. When she returned and discovered her vehicle was no longer charging, she immediately became frustrated. Employees explained that the charger had experienced a fault. Nearby drivers pointed to error messages displayed on the station. Audrey wasn't convinced. Instead, she became certain that someone nearby had unplugged her vehicle. As more people attempted to explain what had happened, Audrey became increasingly argumentative. She accused several drivers of interfering with her charging session. "I've met people like Audrey before. Once they're convinced they've been wronged, every explanation sounds like an excuse to them." The rain continued falling as the disagreement dragged on. Rather than accepting the explanation, Audrey decided she was going to get even. She moves from charging station to charging station, unplugging charging cables from other vehicles. Several drivers confronted her, while others recorded the incident. Employees repeatedly told her to stop. She ignored them. Eventually, Audrey walked toward the charger that had already been removed from service. The connector housing showed visible damage, and rainwater had pooled around the pavement near the base of the unit. Audrey continued arguing as she grabbed the damaged charging handle. The hardest thing to process is how many chances she had to walk away. But sometimes proving a point becomes more important than listening. Audrey appeared determined to prove that the equipment wasn't actually damaged. She grabbed the cracked connector and forcefully pulled on it. What happened next unfolded almost instantly. Several people reported seeing a bright flash. Others heard a sharp electrical pop through the sound of the rain. The damaged components shifted under the force. An electrical arc occurred inside the compromised connector. The current traveled through the charging handle and into Audrey's body. She suddenly became rigid before collapsing backward. People nearby immediately rushed toward her, while others called emergency services. Several bystanders began CPR as they waited for paramedics to arrive. Emergency crews continued resuscitation efforts before transporting Audrey to a nearby trauma center. Despite those efforts, she could not be saved. Investigators Investigators later determined that moisture had entered the damaged connector. When Audrey forcefully moved the handle, weakened components shifted and triggered an electrical arc inside the connector, resulting in the fatal electrical exposure. Sometimes the real danger isn't what we're focused on. Audrey spent so much energy looking for someone to blame that she overlooked the damaged equipment right in front of her. In the end, investigators found no evidence that anyone had tampered with her vehicle. The charger had simply failed. Audrey's death was officially ruled an accidental electrocution caused by contact with damaged charging equipment during the storm. It was March 14, 2015, at a crowded resto bar near the shipping docks in Cebu, Philippines. A regional basketball tournament had just ended, so the place was packed with exhausted workers, players, and regulars. It had the kind of atmosphere where you could already tell somebody was eventually going to start a fight. One of the patrons that night was Randy Castro, 48. He worked as a warehouse supervisor, and by all accounts, he was a guy who liked to be in control. But his personal life was a bit messy. He was going through a tough separation, having issues at work, and regulars noticed he'd been drinking heavily and looking for fights. That night, he was sitting right by the stage, getting visibly annoyed with the karaoke, saying it's too noisy and crowded. Meanwhile, sitting on the opposite side of the room was 63-year-old Lito Mamek, though everyone just called him Tade Lito. Now, back in the day, Lito was actually a regional boxing champion, but you'd never guess it by looking at him. Severe arthritis had slowed him down quite a bit, and these days, he just quietly got by working late-night cleaning jobs. He kept entirely to himself, sitting silently in the corner for a good hour before he finally decided to get up and head toward the stage. Around 11:10 p.m., Lito got up to sing a rock song. He wasn't a rock star, but he was screaming it out and doing his best to hit those high, loud notes. Right away, Randy started heckling him from his plastic stool, loudly mocking his singing over the heavy guitar tracks. Lito just ignored him and kept on with the song, but Randy wouldn't let it go. He climbed onto the low wooden stage with a beer bottle still hanging from one hand and ripped the microphone straight out of Lito's grip mid-song, causing a burst of loud feedback through the speakers. People nearby started turning in their seats immediately as Randy staggered around the stage, mocking Lito's accent and exaggerated singing while laughing at him. When Lito tried to get the mic back, Randy shoved him into a speaker stand. The metal frame rattled loudly and nearly tipped over. Lito didn't swing back. He raised both hands chest high, trying to calm things down while backing away from him. Instead, Randy stepped closer until they were nearly chest to chest, screaming over the karaoke music while beer splashed from the bottle onto the stage floor. Then, without warning, Randy swung his hand across and slapped Lito hard enough to snap his head sideways. And that's when a boxer's instinct took over. Lito slipped the slap, pivoted, and countered with a short, quick right hook, a classic boxer's reflex, just trying to get the guy off him. It landed flush along Randy's jaw with a dull crack that several people near the stage later said they could actually hear over the karaoke music. Randy's legs buckled instantly, and he stumbled backward, completely losing his footing. He tried reaching for the speaker stand with one hand, but missed completely. The back of his heel slid off the stage first before his entire body dropped backward onto the concrete below. He fell right off the side of the stage, and the back of his skull hit the bare concrete floor. The impact was sickening. The entire bar went dead silent instantly. Randy was just lying there on the ground, twitching, as blood started pooling on the floor. Emergency services were called immediately, and paramedics got there after several minutes, but the damage was done. Paramedics later found Randy unconscious and breathing irregularly before rushing him to the hospital in critical condition. Randy went into a coma and passed away the next afternoon. When the medical examiner looked into it, they found that the punch didn't kill him. It was the concrete floor. The fall caused a fractured skull and massive brain swelling. In the end, after interviewing over 20 witnesses and watching the bar's security tapes, the police didn't file any charges against Lito. It was clear he was just defending himself. It's just a sobering reminder of how fast a stupid bar argument can spiral. One guy couldn't handle his liquor or his temper, and it ended up costing him his life over a karaoke song. Later on, the bar actually padded the edges of the stage and changed their rules. It was July 21st, 2016, in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Families were lining up for the Alpine coaster when a dispute over the queue turned deadly. Her name was Chantal Eve Pikes, 45 years old. Now, Chantal was an executive assistant from Spokane, and according to those who knew her, she was a lot. Recently divorced and hyper-focused on keeping control, she had spent her entire summer trip hate posting online about everything from parking prices to blocked photo spots. Apparently, she was already on edge when she stepped into the coaster line that day. And here is where things got ugly. The line was moving slowly because ride operators were doing their jobs, sorting riders by height and weight to keep everyone safe. Right ahead of Chantal was a Hispanic family of 5. Their youngest boy was too small to ride alone, so the attendant called the dad forward to double up with him. Instead of seeing common sense ride safety, Chantal saw a personal insult. She started screaming, accusing the family of cutting the line and claiming favoritism. Mind you, other tourists were already pulling out their phones recording her mid-meltdown. The attendants immediately told her to get back out. One moved toward the cart while another hit the hold button to pause the launch behind her. But Chantal had already yanked the lap belt across herself and started shouting that if anyone touched her, she'd sue the park. With a queue backing up behind her and the family's cart already climbing the lift, staff made the call to keep her seated, recheck the restraint, and give her the safety instructions one more time rather than physically drag her out in front of a crowd. It wasn't that they approved of what she did, they were trying to avoid turning a meltdown into a physical confrontation on the platform. So they locked her belt, confirmed the cart was secure, and gave her the standard spiel again. Keep both hands on the brake levers, maintain distance from the cart ahead, and slow down at the posted signs. Chantal just yelled over them, waved dismissively at the family's cart in front of her, and the operator finally sent her off. If you've never been on an Alpine coaster, you control your own speed using handbrakes. The dad and his little boy ahead of her were taking it super easy because the kid was terrified. But track video showed Chantal was doing the exact opposite. She was flying down the track, closing the gap instantly. And get this, she was riding one-handed so she could use her other hand to flip off or gesture at the family ahead of her. Then came a sharp left curve. The dad braked safely, but Chantal didn't. With a deafening, metallic shriek, the kind of sound that sets your teeth on edge, Chantal's front bumper slammed into the back of the family's cart just as both sleds hit the curve. The family's cart jolted forward, but thankfully, they held their line. Chantal's sled stayed on the track too, but the impact shoved her violently sideways inside the sled at the worst possible moment. Because she had taken the turn with such reckless speed, she wasn't braced for what came next. Her body became nothing more than dead weight. Her torso whipped toward the outside of the turn. Her head collided with the unforgiving steel frame, snapping back as the sled shuddered against the guard structure. It's hard to even think about, but she was folded awkwardly into the seat, her lower body crushed against the restraint bar, left completely at the mercy of the physics she couldn't outrun. The operator hit the emergency stop, and paramedics arrived in less than 10 minutes, but it was already too late. Chantal was gone. The medical examiner confirmed she died from massive blunt force trauma and crushing injuries. State inspectors later checked the track, the brakes, and the carts, and found nothing mechanically wrong with the ride. Investigators concluded the crash happened because Chantal ignored repeated brake warnings, followed the cart ahead too closely, and entered the curve at unsafe speed before rear-ending the family's sled. The operators were not blamed for the collision itself. The park still reviewed whether staff should have shut down the dispatch the moment she forced her way into the cart and refused instructions. The family she targeted walked away physically unhurt, but the little boy she had been screaming about ended up watching her die just feet behind him. And that's the part that really sticks with me. She was so determined to prove she deserved to go first that she crashed straight into the very family she'd been raging at minutes earlier. It was September 7, 2018, at a residential construction site in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Workers were building the frame of a new house in a neighborhood where construction had been taking place for several weeks. The crew was carrying materials between different sections of the property when a familiar neighbor approached the site once again. Her name was Prue Fleet, a 52-year-old retail supervisor who lived nearby. Workers knew her well because she frequently stopped to comment on the project. Prue often believed she knew the right answer to almost every every problem she saw. Whenever she watched the crew work, she seemed convinced that the job could be done better, faster, or smarter if people followed her advice instead. Over time, workers became accustomed to her visits. She would stand near the edge of the property and point out things she believed were wrong. Sometimes, she criticized how materials were handled. Other times, she questioned decisions made by the crew. Most workers ignored the remarks and continued with their tasks. They had heard similar complaints before and usually preferred not to argue. What made Prue different from other neighbors was that she rarely presented her opinions as suggestions. She often spoke as though her ideas were unquestionably correct. The longer the project continued, the more confident she seemed in her belief that she understood construction work better than the people actually performing it. I have always found it strange when someone assumes they know more than the people who do a job every day. Confidence can be useful, but only when it is backed up by real experience. On that day, Prue crossed onto the active work site and walked toward a group of workers installing framing materials. A supervisor informed her that visitors were not allowed inside the work area and asked her to leave. Instead, she continued toward the crew. Several workers later reported that Prue immediately began criticizing their methods and explaining how she believed the work should be done. Crew members attempted to end the discussion and return to work, but Prue continued arguing. As more workers and contractors noticed the confrontation, Prue pointed toward a pneumatic nail gun that had been set down nearby and insisted the task was simple. Workers repeatedly told her not to touch the equipment. She ignored them. Determined to prove her point, Prue picked up the nail gun and carried it toward a partially framed wall. Now remember, nobody challenged Prue to prove herself. The demonstration was entirely her idea. Holding the nail gun, Prue continued explaining how simple the task supposedly was. She positioned herself near the wall and pressed the front of the tool against a piece of framing lumber. Workers again warned her to stop. Moments later, her finger contacted the trigger. The nail entered the lumber as intended. Several workers immediately told her to put the tool down, but Prue continued talking while holding it. Witnesses later reported that she appeared more focused on proving her point than on handling the equipment safely. Instead of setting the tool aside, she lowered it against the front of her body while continuing to argue with the crew about how the work should be done. During the movement, the contact tip of the nail gun was pressed against her upper chest. Her finger remained on the trigger, and the tool discharged unexpectedly. The nail struck her at close range. She immediately dropped the tool and collapsed. Workers rushed to assist her while emergency responders were called. Witnesses later provided highly consistent descriptions of the incident. Physical evidence at the scene matched their accounts of what had occurred. Prue was transported to a hospital but died shortly afterward from her injuries. There's a huge difference between understanding something and believing you understand it. Unfortunately, Prue learned that difference in the worst possible way. Investigators examined the nail gun and found no defects. The investigation concluded that Prue's fatal injury occurred when she unintentionally discharged the tool while handling it herself. No findings were made against the construction crew, and the work site resumed normal operations after the investigation was completed. It was October 9th, 2015, in Seoul, South Korea. Dinner hour had just begun, and a busy Korean barbecue restaurant was filling up fast. Portable butane stoves sat in the middle of every table as servers hurried between customers carrying trays of raw meat and side dishes. One of the tourists visiting that night was 52-year-old Rosie Gale Halloway, a high-end interior designer from Ohio. She was 52, a high-end interior designer from across town, and let me tell you, she wore her taste and authority like a suit of armor. People who worked with her said she was the definition of meticulous, the kind of woman who would turn a simple color palette choice into a lecture on artistic vision. She had spent the afternoon posting photos around Seoul, repeatedly comparing everything to back home. Friends traveling with her later said she kept talking about finally trying Korean barbecue, expecting enormous platters of meat like the steakhouses she loved in the United States. When the server placed several small slices of pork belly on the grill instead of one large steak, Rosie frowned immediately. She complained that the portions were tiny and accused the restaurant of overcharging tourists. A couple sitting at the next table overheard her frustration. Trying to be friendly, they explained in simple English that Korean barbecue is meant to be cooked in a few pieces at a time, wrapped in lettuce with rice, garlic, and sauces. They even kindly demonstrated how to make a proper bite-sized wrap. Unfortunately, instead of appreciating the help, Rosie took it as an insult. She loudly told them she didn't need strangers teaching her how to eat dinner and insisted Americans knew how to cook meat properly. the restaurant suddenly went quiet. Even the server looked uncomfortable. Determined to prove everyone wrong, Rosie ignored the tongs the restaurant provided. She crowded nearly the entire platter of pork onto the small grill at once, stacking slices on top of each other until grease began dripping directly onto the burner below. Thick smoke started pouring upward, and orange flames occasionally flared around the edges of the pan. The server hurried over and politely asked her to remove some of the meat because the grease was creating dangerous flare-ups. Rosie waved him away, insisting she knew exactly what she was doing. Within another minute, the flames grew higher as more rendered fat dripped onto the burner. Rather than simply turning the stove off, Rosie grabbed the portable butane stove itself and tried to slide it across the table while it was still operating, apparently hoping to move it away from the flames. In the process, she accidentally knocked the grill plate slightly off-center. Burning grease spilled onto the butane canister compartment underneath, exposing the cartridge to intense heat. The server immediately shouted for everyone to move back. Rosie refused, still arguing that everyone was overreacting. Seconds later, the overheated butane cartridge vented and ruptured. The escaping gas ignited almost instantly, producing a violent fireball that blasted upward across the table. The force threw the hot grill and cookware into Rosie's chest and face, while burning fuel sprayed across her clothing. Nearby diners stumbled backward as chairs overturned throughout the restaurant. Employees immediately shut off the remaining stoves, while customers rushed over with fire extinguishers and wet towels. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Rosie suffered extensive deep burns across much of her upper body, severe inhalation injuries from breathing the superheated gases, and multiple blunt force injuries from the exploding cookware. Despite emergency treatment, the damage to her lungs and the burns covering a large portion of her body proved too severe. She died later that night at the hospital. Honestly, there's a bitter irony there. Rosie spent the entire evening insisting everyone else was doing it wrong, even the people who had been cooking that way their whole lives. The only advice she refused to accept was the advice that could have prevented the explosion. The restaurant later added larger warning signs in English, reminding customers never to overload the grill or move portable butane stoves while they are operating. It was June 22, 2017, in Phoenix, Arizona. Summer heat shimmered off the pavement as shoppers hurried in and out of air-conditioned stores trying to finish their errands before heading home. Julie Grace Hampton was 46 years old, a real estate agent who basically ran her entire life on a stopwatch. Showings back-to-back, phone calls between appointments, more showings after that. If you've ever known someone who sighs audibly at a red light, that was pretty much Julie's energy at all times. Co-workers used to say Julie couldn't stand in a line without eventually walking to the front of it. She'd cut through roped-off queues at the bank, argue her way past a hostess stand when a table wasn't ready, tell contractors their timelines were flexible whether they agreed or not. She was also a regular customer at the local home improvement warehouse and loved reminding employees how much money she'd spent there over the years whenever things didn't go her way. Julie genuinely believed loyal customers deserved special treatment, especially if it meant skipping a few inconvenient rules. That evening, she stopped by a large home improvement warehouse after work, just needing one last item before the store closed. But when she reached the aisle she needed, it was blocked off. An employee explained it would only be a short wait while a forklift positioned a heavy pallet onto the top rack. Julie reminded the employee that she shopped there all the time and had spent thousands of dollars at the store over the years. She insisted loyal customers shouldn't have to wait over something that would only take 5 seconds. The employee apologized but firmly explained the aisle would remain closed until the lift was finished. This is honestly pretty routine in big box stores, and most people would simply grab something else and come back a few minutes later. While the employee was momentarily pulled aside to answer another customer's question a few feet away, Julie saw her opening. She stepped around the barrier and walked straight into the closed aisle without a second thought. Here's the part that made this so dangerous. From that height, the forklift operator's line of sight was partially blocked by the load itself, so he had absolutely no idea someone had just entered the space directly below him. He was still positioning the pallet on the rack before it had been fully settled into place when the load shifted off-center. It doesn't take much for that to happen. An uneven pallet, a slightly loose stack, a few inches of imbalance, and gravity takes care of the rest. A ground employee spotted Julie walking into the aisle and immediately shouted a warning. The operator up top heard it over the sound of the mast motor and hit the controls to stop the lift, but the pallet had already tipped past the point where stopping the machine made any difference. Boxes and loose material started sliding off the edge first, spilling outward as the pallet tilted, then the pallet itself came off the rack, dropping about 18 feet down and outward from where it had been sitting. Julie was roughly 6 or 7 feet from the base of the rack when the load let go, close enough to be caught in the spill zone as everything came down. She had only a couple of seconds between the warning and impact, nowhere near enough to get clear. The heaviest portion of the pallet, several hundred pounds of packaged tile, struck her across the head and upper body and pinned her to the concrete floor. Employees ran over and started pulling boxes off her while someone called for emergency help within a minute of the load coming down. Responders arrived about 8 minutes later, but Julie's injuries, severe head trauma, and significant internal injuries from the crushing weight weren't something that window of time could change. Julie died from the injuries she sustained under the fallen load. The forklift operator and the rest of the floor staff were physically unharmed, though badly shaken. Surveillance footage from 2 angles later confirmed the sequence: Julie stepping around a posted barrier, walking into an active work zone, and the pallet coming loose seconds after. The investigation closed it out as exactly what it looked like: a preventable accident caused by her own decision to enter a restricted area, nothing more. It was February 18, 2018, in Cleveland, Ohio. The weather outside was cold, with temperatures hovering near freezing. Inside a local hospital, portions of the building were undergoing renovations, leaving some departments operating with fewer employees than usual. By the evening, most visitors had already left, and the hallways had grown noticeably quieter. Among the remaining visitors was 55-year-old Lois Fife. Lois was a retired office worker who had spent the last several months convinced that the hospital was hiding information from families. The belief started after the death of a distant relative. What began as suspicion gradually turned into an obsession. Lois frequently visited the hospital, demanding answers and accusing staff of concealing wrongdoing. She filed complaints, confronted employees, and repeatedly attempted to enter areas that were off limits to visitors. Security personnel had escorted her away from restricted sections more than once. The warnings only strengthened her belief that something was being hidden. Over time, Lois began telling other visitors that bodies were being concealed from families. She became determined to gather proof herself. Rather than trusting official explanations, she convinced herself that the only way to uncover the truth was to investigate the hospital from the inside. On February 18th, Lois arrived during visiting hours. When the time came for visitors to leave, she stayed behind. Instead of heading toward the exits, she moved through service hallways and staff corridors. Security footage later showed her making her way deeper into the building toward the pathology department. You know what stands out to me here? Lois wasn't sneaking into the morgue because she was lost or confused. She went there because she genuinely believed she was about to uncover something huge. Eventually, Lois bypassed several restricted access doors and entered the morgue area. Inside, she searched for anything that could support her claims. She looked through storage areas and photographed equipment. The longer she searched, the more convinced she became that she was getting closer to proving what she had believed for months. Then, everything changed. At some point, Lois became aware that security personnel were conducting a patrol nearby. Rather than identify herself and risk being removed from the building again, she made a decision that would ultimately cost her life. She spotted an empty refrigerated morgue drawer. Instead of leaving, Lois climbed inside. The drawer was designed for temporary body storage and extended several feet into a refrigerated compartment. To avoid being discovered, she pulled the drawer closed behind her. That decision immediately created a new problem. As the drawer shut, part of the sliding mechanism shifted out of alignment. The tray became jammed in its tracks. What Lois expected to be a temporary hiding place had suddenly become a trap. The drawer had no interior release handle because it was never meant to hold a living person. When the tray became misaligned, it jammed against the frame, and the cramped compartment left Lois with little room to force it back open. She was now confined inside a narrow metal compartment with no practical way to open it from within. The refrigerated system continued operating as intended. Temperatures inside remained just above freezing. As the hours passed, Lois remained trapped. The cold gradually affected her ability to think clearly and move effectively. Her body temperature continued dropping through the night. Eventually, the prolonged exposure became too much for her body to withstand. By the time anyone discovered what had happened, Lois had already died. The following day, maintenance personnel inspecting the area noticed unusual resistance while checking one of the storage drawers. When they opened it, they found Lois inside. Authorities later reviewed surveillance footage and reconstructed her movements through the building. The medical examiner determined that Lois died from hypothermia caused by prolonged entrapment inside the refrigerated compartment. Her death was ruled accidental. Hospital records showed a history of previous incidents involving Lois attempting to enter restricted areas. Investigators found no evidence supporting her claims of a cover-up. Instead, the evidence showed that she had entered the morgue on her own and became trapped while hiding from security personnel. In the aftermath, the facility upgraded access controls around several restricted departments. What stays with me is how ordinary the final discovery was. After months of accusations and theories, investigators didn't find a cover-up. They found Lois exactly where her own decisions had led her. It was August 22nd, 2016 in Phoenix, and the afternoon heat was well over 100 degrees, making everyone miserable. Out on I-10, construction barrels squeezed traffic down to a single lane, causing a massive bumper-to-bumper backup. Everyone was stuck, crawling along, completely frustrated and totally on edge. Derek Black was 51, and he used to run his own contracting business. But after a bankruptcy and a divorce, he'd become incredibly bitter. His friends said he was obsessed with the idea that everyone was disrespecting him. He actually made a habit of filming people in traffic and posting the arguments online like he was some kind of internet hero. Personally, I could say he has a main character syndrome and loved cornering people just to make them look bad. That day, he was stuck behind Harold Boone, a 67-year-old retired Army Ranger who used to teach restraint techniques to security guards. Harold was driving an old truck full of irrigation gear. At one point, Harold swerved just an inch over the lane line to avoid a construction barrel. He corrected it right away, but Derek absolutely snapped. He went full Karen mode, aggressively tailgating him, slamming on his horn, and holding his phone up to the window to film Harold while driving like a maniac. As traffic slowed near the construction merge, vehicles were eventually forced off Interstate 10 and onto the frontage road because of lane closures ahead. Cars stacked bumper to bumper approaching the next intersection, where a long red light stopped traffic completely. When traffic finally ground to a halt at a red light on the frontage road, Derek threw a total temper tantrum. He parked his SUV right in the middle of the road, left his door wide open, and marched back to Harold's truck with his phone recording like he was capturing a crime. He started throwing a fit, shouting insults, and literally kicking the side of Harold's truck door. When that didn't get the reaction he wanted, he began violently pounding on the glass, screaming at Harold through the windshield, and then yanked the driver's side door wide open. Witnesses said Harold stayed in his seat and tried to wave him off, telling him to calm down, but Derek wasn't letting it go. He reached into the cab, holding a metal baseball bat he had grabbed from his SUV, and lunged at Harold, screaming threats. Drivers in nearby lanes later said Derek was halfway inside the truck at that point, swinging the bat wildly through the doorway while Harold tried to shield himself against the steering wheel. One witness said the bat struck the dashboard hard enough to crack part of the plastic panel near the gauges. Another driver reported hearing Harold yell after Derek raised the bat again near his head. Fearing for his life with an aggressive stranger violently forcing his way into his truck with a weapon, Harold reached for the handgun he kept in his console and fired once, hitting Derek in the chest. The shot hit Derek high in the upper torso at close range. Witnesses said his body instantly jerked backward from the doorway before he lost his footing on the oily pavement beside the median. Derek stumbled backward out of the doorway, dropping the bat, and collapsed onto the pavement beside the median. The loud pop of the gunshot instantly stopped traffic. Derek was lying there, gasping for air, as drivers jumped out of their cars to help. Several witnesses later described seeing blood rapidly soaking through his shirt, while Harold remained inside the truck, visibly shaken, still holding the handgun pointed downward near his lap. Someone called 911, and paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but the bullet had done too much internal damage. He passed away shortly after arriving. When the police looked at the evidence, including the video on Derek's own phone, it was clear as day. Derek was the aggressor. He had illegally forced his way into Harold's truck and assaulted him with a deadly weapon. Prosecutors didn't file any charges against Harold, ruling the shooting as a clear case of self-defense. When detectives looked into Derek's social media, they found a history of these road rage videos. It was always the same thing, him bullying strangers over minor driving mistakes. It was August 4th, 2017, in Denver, Colorado. Late Friday night, traffic crawled through a crowded construction zone packed with ride-shares, pedestrians, cyclists, and concrete barriers. One of the passengers waiting was 41-year-old Dana Jacobs. Now, to understand what happens next, you have to understand who Dana was. She was a successful suburban realtor, a PTA mom, and someone who cared deeply about her public image. But according to her friends, she also had this habit of taking every minor inconvenience personally. If a waiter forgot her drink, it wasn't a mistake, it was a personal insult. And her weapon of choice? Pulling out her phone to record people until they backed down. On this night, she was tired, tipsy from a charity dinner, and already furious over a petty argument with another parent. Her driver that night was Rami Harris, a 46-year-old dad working the grueling late shift just to pay for his daughter's nursing school. He picks Dana up, pulls into that nightmare construction zone, and does exactly what any good driver would do. He keeps checking his mirrors to navigate the tight lane. However, on Dana's mind, Rami isn't looking at traffic. She decides he's staring at her chest. She starts aggressively demanding to know why he's looking at her. Rami tries to explain that he's literally just trying not to crash, but Dana's already triggered, because apparently checking your mirrors while driving is a crime now. Based on the dashcam footage report, Dana shoves her phone between the front seats, calls him a creep, and completely drowns him out. The driver even offers to just end the ride and pull over, but she's way too busy trying to go viral to listen to reason. Then, she takes it to a terrifying level. She grabs a canister of pepper spray from her purse. Rami sees it in the rearview mirror and begs her not to spray it inside a moving car. But Dana doesn't listen. She leans forward and sprays him directly in the face. Imagine this. You're driving through a construction bottleneck when, out of nowhere, your eyes, nose, and throat feel like they've been set on fire. Rami screams, jerks the wheel, and the car slams into a line of construction barrels. Chemical spray floods the cabin almost instantly, and within seconds, both of them are coughing, choking, and fighting for air. This is where panic turns fatal. Instead of staying put, a screaming Dana yanks her door handle open while the car is still rolling. Because the sedan was already hugging the concrete barrier on the passenger side, the door only opened part way before its outer edge smashed straight into the barrier. The hit violently forced the door backward against its hinges while Dana was still halfway out of the seat. One leg was still inside the car, but her upper body had lurched through the opening. That left her trapped in the narrowing space between the door and the barrier as the car kept scraping forward. Witnesses on the sidewalk watched in absolute horror as the moving car dragged the twisted door along the barrier, pinning Dana's torso in that gap and crushing her against the concrete. Her screams stopped almost instantly. The sedan continued another few feet before finally stopping, leaving her folded between the damaged door frame and the barrier. By the time paramedics arrived, Rami was stumbling around the pavement, half blind and coughing, begging people to help her. Firefighters had to literally cut the car door apart to get to Dana, but she went into cardiac arrest and died right there on the street. The autopsy report was brutal: a crushed pelvis, broken ribs, a torn lung, and massive internal bleeding. The official cause of death was ruled an accidental crush injury caused by passenger interference. Afterward, police reviewed the dashcam footage and cleared Rami completely, finding that the crash and Dana's fatal injuries began when she sprayed the driver and tried to climb out of the moving vehicle inside the construction lane. It was October 22, 2014, at a farmer's market in Eugene, Oregon. Among the booths was a stand offering wild mushrooms that had been collected and identified by experienced foragers. What began as a disagreement over prices at that stand would eventually lead to a tragedy that unfolded over several days. The woman at the center of the story was Maricar Clancy, a 49-year-old bookkeeper. She was known among friends and family for being extremely careful with money. Maricar disliked paying more than she believed something was worth, and she often challenged sellers when she thought prices were too high. That morning, she stopped at the mushroom stand, hoping to buy ingredients for a future meal. Instead of making a purchase, she began questioning the prices. The vendor explained that identifying wild mushrooms required training, experience, and careful inspection. Witnesses later recalled that Maricar did not accept the explanation. She believed the sellers were using fear to justify higher prices and insisted that the mushrooms should cost less. The discussion grew louder as more shoppers noticed what was happening. Maricar continued arguing while the vendor attempted to explain the dangers of misidentifying wild mushrooms. Eventually, market staff intervened and asked her to leave the area. Witnesses later remembered that Maricar walked away frustrated and determined not to spend money on the mushrooms. By this point, the argument wasn't really about mushrooms anymore. It had become a matter of pride, and pride has a way of pushing people toward decisions they normally wouldn't make. Later that day, Maricar traveled to a wooded section of a public park. She carried a basket and a field guide containing photographs and descriptions of different mushroom species. Her goal was simple. If vendors could gather mushrooms themselves, she believed she could do the same and avoid paying market prices. As she searched through the woods, several local residents noticed what she was doing. According to later accounts, they warned her to be careful because dangerous mushrooms grew in the area. Some explained that poisonous varieties could closely resemble edible ones. Maricar ignored the warnings. She spent hours collecting mushrooms that appeared similar to the photographs in her guidebook. She focused mainly on visual similarities and relied on her own judgment. By the time she finished, her basket contained several different specimens. Unknown to her, some of the mushrooms she selected were death caps, a highly poisonous species responsible for many fatal poisonings. No experienced forager reviewed her collection. No expert confirmed her choices. Maricar never sought a second opinion before taking the mushrooms home. Back at home, she cleaned the mushrooms and prepared them for a meal. A family member reportedly questioned whether she was certain about her identification. Maricar remained confident and moved forward with cooking. I keep thinking about that moment at home when her family member questioned the mushrooms. Most people would have paused and checked again. Maricar treated that warning the same way she treated every other warning she received that day. After eating the meal, Maricar initially appeared fine. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and there was no immediate reason to suspect anything was wrong. However, after many hours had passed, she began experiencing severe symptoms. Family members became concerned as her condition worsened and sought medical help. Over the following days, doctors worked to determine what had caused the illness. Specialists examined the remaining mushrooms from Maricar's collection. Testing eventually confirmed the presence of death caps among the specimens she had gathered in the park. Despite medical treatment, her condition continued to deteriorate. Maricar died in the hospital several days later. Investigators reviewed the circumstances surrounding the poisoning. Witnesses from both the farmer's market and the woodland area described warning her about the risks of collecting wild mushrooms without proper knowledge. Toxicology findings confirmed fatal mushroom poisoning, and experts traced the poisonous mushrooms directly to those she had personally selected. Authorities found no evidence of foul play. The investigation concluded that the poisoning resulted from mushrooms Maricar gathered, identified, prepared, and consumed herself. The same expertise she had dismissed during the argument at the market ultimately became the key factor used to identify the source of the poisoning. Investigators determined that her death could be traced directly back to the decision she made after refusing to pay for professionally identified mushrooms, linking the fatal outcome to the choice she made while trying to prove she knew better. It was May 3rd, 2019. The lunch rush at a burger place in South Peoria Avenue in Tulsa was winding down. Outside, the afternoon temperature hovered in the mid-70s, while inside the restaurant, the air conditioner hummed quietly over a handful of families and construction workers finishing their meals. It was the kind of slow afternoon where the biggest excitement usually came from someone asking for extra fries. That was before Diane Miller. Jones walked through the door. She was 48 and had built a small but notorious online following reviewing local restaurants. But the problem was, Diane wasn't interested in honest reviews. She deliberately pushed employees until someone snapped, then uploaded the confrontation for views. She called it exposing terrible customer service. But to everyone else, including me, it's simply called bullying. After leaving her office job several years earlier, she lived off a modest inheritance and spent nearly every day searching for her next viral argument. To Diane, every restaurant was just another stage. That afternoon, she brought her own prop. Inside her purse was a small bottle of industrial-strength capsaicin extract, an extremely concentrated pepper oil normally handled with protective gloves and measured a few drops at a time during commercial food production. Used correctly, it flavored enormous batches of food. Used the way Diane intended, contended it had no business anywhere near a lunch table. Her plan was simple: demand the restaurant use it on her burger, film them refusing, then embarrass them online. The manager immediately refused, explaining that restaurant policy prohibited customers from adding outside ingredients to food served in the dining room. Diane argued that it was her burger and that she had every right to season it however she wanted. The manager stood firm, repeating that if she insisted on using the extract, she would have to leave. Frustrated that she wasn't getting the confrontation she wanted, Diane stormed back to her table, propped her phone against a napkin holder, and started live streaming. She immediately criticized the restaurant, calling it dirty, cramped, overpriced, and painfully slow, while accusing the staff of having no idea how to treat paying customers. She then unscrewed the bottle and poured the concentrated capsaicin extract over her burger until the patty glistened beneath a thick layer of orange oil. Before she even took the first bite, the air around the table turned hostile. Diane smiled into the camera. Then she took a huge bite, but within seconds, her expression completely changed. Her eyes flooded with tears. She began coughing uncontrollably as her lips and tongue turned an angry shade of red. She reached for her drink, but even swallowing water only made the burning worse. Instead of stopping, she forced out a laugh for the live stream and insisted everyone had exaggerated the heat. Then she took another bite. However, almost immediately, her voice changed. The confident shouting became a raspy whisper. She grabbed at her throat, trying to clear it, but each breath sounded tighter than the last. Witnesses later told investigators she looked confused more than frightened, as though she couldn't understand why she suddenly couldn't speak. Her neck muscles strained with every breath. She stood up, stumbled into the edge of another table, and desperately tried to inhale, but only a high-pitched wheeze came out. The live stream captured her repeatedly clutching her throat before collapsing onto the floor as horrified customers rushed toward her. Employees called emergency services immediately. An off-duty nurse recognized that her airway was rapidly closing and tried to keep her calm while waiting for paramedics. Emergency crews arrived within minutes and attempted to place a breathing tube, but the swelling inside her throat had progressed so quickly that they couldn't safely pass it. They performed an emergency surgical airway before rushing her to the hospital. Despite aggressive treatment, the lack of oxygen had already caused catastrophic damage. She was pronounced dead a short time later. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental. According to the autopsy, the massive quantity of concentrated capsaicin had caused extensive chemical burns to the tissues of her mouth, throat, and voice box. The resulting swelling rapidly sealed off her airway, leaving emergency responders with almost no time to reverse the damage. Investigators cleared the restaurant of any wrongdoing. The restaurant reopened the next day, but the incident led management to ban outside food additives and post new safety notices for customers. It was February 8, 2018, in Seattle, Washington. Guests dressed in suits and evening gowns gathered inside a beautifully restored historic theater for an annual charity gala. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as donors mingled over dinner before the night's fundraising auction and keynote speech. Kristen Ramsey was 41 years old and owned a boutique clothing store downtown. Running a small business meant she spent plenty of time networking, attending fundraisers, and rubbing shoulders with the same people year after year. Somewhere along the way, she started believing her name alone should open a few extra doors. By the time dinner was served, Kristen was already annoyed. Another local business owner had been seated at the head table near the stage while she was placed several rows back. Certain she'd earned better treatment, she complained to event staff, who politely explained the seating chart had been finalized weeks earlier. Needless to say, she wasn't happy about it. Maybe I've been going to charity galas all wrong, but I always thought the point was to raise money, not fight over the seating chart. As the evening went on, Kristen noticed an upper balcony overlooking the theater. It offered one of the best views in the building, but guests weren't allowed up there. Earlier that afternoon, maintenance workers had discovered one section of the decorative railing shifted slightly under pressure during a routine inspection. The balcony had been closed until engineers could examine it after the event. Kristen walked over anyway and asked if she could go upstairs. An event volunteer apologized and explained the balcony was closed for everyone's safety. Kristen argued for another minute before walking away, clearly frustrated. She lingered near the back of the ballroom for a while, glancing up at the balcony every few seconds as if she still couldn't let it go. A few minutes later, as guests were being ushered into the ballroom for the keynote speech, the volunteer stepped away to help direct people to their seats. Seeing her chance, Kristen slipped through a nearby service doorway leading to the upper level. The balcony was quiet now. Kristen walked toward the center railing overlooking the stage below. From up there, she could see the entire ballroom, and for a moment, it probably felt like she'd finally gotten the spot she thought she deserved. She pulled out her phone and tried to fit the stage, the audience, and the chandeliers into a single photo. To get a better angle, she leaned farther over the decorative railing and rested more of her weight against it. At first, there was only a faint creak, then another. Before Kristen had time to react, the railing shifted outward beneath her. She instinctively reached for it, but the weakened section tore free from its anchors. Kristen fell nearly 20 feet into the theater lobby below. Guests heard the sharp crack of wood and metal, followed by a heavy impact that echoed through the entrance hall. For a second, the room went completely silent. Then, people started screaming as several guests rushed toward her while others backed away in shock. Event staff immediately called emergency services while security cleared the area so paramedics could reach her. She was still alive when they arrived and was rushed to a nearby trauma center with severe head, chest, and internal injuries. Despite emergency treatment, she died a short time later. Investigators later determined the balcony itself had remained structurally sound. The failure was isolated to the decorative railing, which had partially separated from its original anchors, the same issue maintenance staff had identified during their inspection earlier that day. Engineers had already scheduled the railing for repair once the gala concluded. Security footage also showed Kristen entering the restricted area only minutes after being denied access by event staff. Her death was ruled accidental. It was April 9, 2022, in Phoenix, Arizona. The day was warm and dry, and a busy shopping center parking lot was crowded with vehicles and shoppers. It seemed like a routine afternoon, but a minor disagreement between two strangers was about to escalate far beyond a parking complaint. Most parking lot disagreements last less than a minute. Someone gets annoyed, a few words are exchanged, and everyone goes their separate ways. For 46-year-old Miranda Ferre, things rarely ended that simply. The small business owner had a reputation for confronting people over perceived slights, and once she felt disrespected, walking away was often the last thing on her mind. That afternoon, Miranda parked beside another vehicle near one of the store entrances. The neighboring vehicle was legally parked within its space, but Miranda immediately took issue with the way it was positioned. When the other driver stepped out, Miranda confronted her. The woman appeared willing to move on and continue shopping. Miranda wasn't. What should have been a brief exchange continued. As the woman walked away, Miranda followed behind her, continuing the argument. As they moved through the parking lot, the distance covered grew from a few feet to multiple rows of parked vehicles. The longer the disagreement lasted, the more invested Miranda became in it. Instead of letting the matter go, she continued pursuing the woman through the lot. More shoppers began noticing the confrontation. Some slowed down to watch, while others simply tried to avoid it. Sometimes people get so focused on winning an argument that they forget why it started in the first place. As the confrontation stretched on, several bystanders began recording on their phones. Even then, Miranda refused to disengage. Evidence later reviewed by investigators showed that the woman repeatedly attempted to continue on her way while Miranda continued following her. The disagreement moved through a large section of the parking lot before reaching a breaking point. Eventually, Miranda grabbed the woman's shopping cart during the confrontation. That moment escalated the situation immediately. The woman attempted to create distance. Miranda continued moving toward her. A short time later, the woman deployed pepper spray at close range. The spray struck Miranda directly in the face, affecting her eyes, nose, and mouth. At first, the reaction appeared typical. Miranda began coughing and stumbling as nearby shoppers watched from a distance. But within minutes, the situation became far more serious. Miranda's breathing became increasingly difficult. The swelling inside her airway progressed rapidly. As her condition worsened, nearby shoppers began recognizing that this was no longer a normal reaction. Most people watching probably thought the confrontation was over. Unfortunately, it was only getting worse. The sounds of wheezing became noticeable. Her breathing grew more strained. Before long, she collapsed onto the pavement. Bystanders called emergency services and attempted to help while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Emergency crews quickly recognized signs of a severe allergic reaction and began treatment at the scene. Despite those efforts, Miranda's condition continued deteriorating. Her airway became critically obstructed and she suffered cardiac arrest. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but doctors were unable to save her. The medical examiner later determined that Miranda died from an anaphylactic reaction triggered by exposure to a component within the pepper spray. Investigators reviewed numerous cell phone videos recorded throughout the confrontation. The footage documented the dispute from its early stages in the parking lot through the medical emergency that followed. Authorities also examined whether the use of force met legal standards under the circumstances. In the end, investigators found that the original parking complaint was minor. The evidence showed that Miranda repeatedly chose to continue the confrontation long after opportunities to leave had presented themselves. Her death was officially ruled a fatal allergic reaction caused by exposure to pepper spray during the incident. It was November 7, 2017, inside a gym in Riverside, California, during the chaotic after-work rush. The place was absolutely slammed with college kids and people straight from the office, all fighting over the same equipment. The free weight area was a total mess with heavy plates and gym bags scattered everywhere on the floor, making it a complete safety hazard. Carl Mendez was one of the regulars. He was 49 and used to be a competitive bodybuilder back in the day. But his life had hit a rough patch, injuries ended his heavy lifting, and his personal training business dried up. The gym was basically all he had left, but he acted like he owned the place. He'd hover around the squat racks for hours, staring down the younger members like they were trespassing in his backyard. It's sad, really, how Carl just can't let go of his past. That evening, a 36-year-old powerlifter named Dana Mercer was using the center squat rack. She also happened to teach women self-defense, but she was just there to get her workout done. Carl marched over during her rest break and started complaining that she was taking too long. Dana calmly told him she only had 2 sets left and turned back to her workout. Carl couldn't handle that. Witnesses later said he started pacing around, trash-talking her out loud, and then actually kicked her water bottle right across the floor. Talk about a very petty and childish behavior. Several gym members later said Carl kept circling closer between her sets, like he was trying to intimidate her into leaving. He slammed weight plates onto a nearby rack just to get her attention, while muttering insults loud enough for half the free weight section to hear. The tension got so noticeable that a few people stopped lifting and started watching from nearby benches. Once Dana finished her set and racked the weights, Carl stepped right into her face. Someone actually started filming on their phone as Carl reached out and grabbed her arm to pull her away from the rack. Witnesses said Dana tried stepping away to create distance, but Carl kept advancing chest to chest while yelling about the rack. The phone footage later showed him jerking her arm hard enough to throw her balance off briefly before she pulled free. Several people nearby started shouting at Carl to back off, but he kept moving forward anyway. Dana didn't panic. She broke his grip, planted her feet, and shoved him away to get some breathing room. It wasn't even a crazy hard push, but Carl was already off balance. As he stumbled backward, his heel caught a 45-pound weight plate that someone had carelessly left on the floor. The plate rolled slightly under his shoe as his upper body continued backward. Witnesses later said his arms flailed for balance, but there was nothing behind him except the bench. His lower back struck the edge first, twisting his body sideways, and a split second later, the side of his neck slammed directly into the exposed steel adjustment rail near the corner of the bench. He hit the floor fully conscious, but within seconds, he was telling people he couldn't move or feel anything below his neck. Witnesses later said his arms and legs stayed completely still while he struggled to breathe. They called emergency services immediately, and he was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The impact had literally broken his neck and severely damaged his spinal cord. Doctors later found the injury had disrupted the upper part of his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down and causing catastrophic swelling that affected his breathing overnight. He passed away the very next morning. After checking the gym's security cameras and the phone video, the police didn't file any charges against Dana. It was obvious Carl started the whole thing, and she was just defending herself. The gym ended up changing its layout and clearing out the clutter, but for a long time, nobody wanted to use that center rack because everyone remembered exactly what happened there. It was a damp Friday afternoon in Seattle, October 12th, 2018. Capitol Hill is full of people doing exactly what the neighborhood is known for, lining up outside coffee shops, drifting between boutiques, and stepping around people taking photos and filming little street videos for social media in the middle of the sidewalk and curb lane. Just beyond the bakery entrance was Taryn Vale, 29 years old, a local lifestyle influencer who built a nice little brand reviewing cafes and unboxing skincare. To her followers, she's the ultimate relatable cool girl. But off camera. Let's just say Taryn had a major reputation for taking life's minor inconveniences incredibly personally. On this particular afternoon, she was already running late, stressed out, and carrying a heavy leather tote bag packed to the brim. Just a few feet away, we have another local creator, Maya Ferris. Maya is just doing what influencers do, filming a quick street-style video outside a bakery. It's the kind of content we see every single day on our feeds. She's panning her phone on a stabilizer, holding a pastry totally in her zone. Then, Taryn walks right through the background of the shot. Now, most of us would just keep walking, maybe roll our eyes. Taryn? She stops dead in her tracks, turns around, and completely loses it. She demands to know why Maya is filming her. Maya tries to play it cool, lowers the phone, and even offers to delete the clip, but Taryn isn't having it. Witnesses later said she seemed less mad about the camera and more triggered by the idea that people might be laughing at her between takes. Within seconds, the heated argument spills right onto the busy corner. Maya's backing up, desperately trying to de-escalate. Taryn keeps advancing, screaming that these content creators think they own the neighborhood and can point cameras wherever they want. Then, things get violent. Taryn swings that heavy leather tote bag like a weapon. The first hit catches Maya right in the face. The second strike smashes into the phone stabilizer, sending the device crashing to the wet concrete. But guess what? The phone keeps recording from the ground. As Maya's friend yells for help, two heroic bystanders jump in to separate them. One grabs Taryn's arm, and the other pushes her back to create space. But Taryn is completely blinded by fury. She's fighting them off, trying to lunge around them to get back at Maya, totally oblivious to where her feet actually are. Her right heel catches the sloped, wet edge of a painted bike lane. She slips. Instantly, Taryn pitches backward off the curb, right into the street. And this is where the timing becomes absolutely heartbreaking. At that exact microsecond, a box delivery truck is crawling through the intersection on a green light. The driver is being careful, but Taryn drops into his blind spot so fast, she's just a flash of movement. She hits the asphalt hard, and before she can even roll away, the truck's front tire rolls directly over her lower body. The screaming just stops. Emergency crews rushed her straight to a medical center, but the devastating internal crush injuries were just too severe. She was tragically pronounced dead shortly after arrival. When the police checked the footage from storefronts, traffic cams, and ironically, Maya's phone still rolling on the ground, the story was undeniable. No one pushed her. It was a freak, tragic accident born entirely out of a sudden burst of rage. It was March 12, 2022, on an interstate freeway near Dallas, Texas. Traffic was moving steadily that afternoon. Among the vehicles on the road was a rideshare car carrying a passenger on what should have been a routine trip home. The passenger was Candace Burrell, a 41-year-old sales representative who traveled frequently for work. Because she used rideshare services so often, she paid close attention to her account rating. People who knew her said she took ratings personally. A lower score felt less like feedback and more like an insult. Candace often became upset when she believed she had been treated unfairly and frequently looked for someone to blame. People who knew her said small disagreements that most passengers would ignore sometimes stayed on her mind for days. Drivers who had interacted with her in the past described her as argumentative and prone to taking minor issues personally. The trip began normally. During the ride, Candace checked her account and noticed that her rating remained lower than she believed it should be. She immediately began questioning the driver about how ratings worked and whether drivers could affect a passenger's score. The driver gave short responses while focusing on traffic. Candace continued pressing the issue and repeatedly leaned forward from the back seat. What began as a simple question slowly turned into an argument that neither side seemed able to end. I can understand being annoyed by a bad rating. Nobody likes feeling judged. But getting home safely matters a lot more than a number on a screen. As the conversation continued, Candace became increasingly frustrated. Investigators later determined that she wanted access to information on the driver's phone because she believed it might explain her rating. The driver refused. Candace removed her seatbelt and leaned forward between the front seats. Dashcam footage later showed that she was no longer sitting properly in the rear passenger area. What surprises me is how quickly this stopped being about the rating itself. At some point, Candace seemed more focused on winning the argument than on getting home safely. She then reached toward the dashboard and grabbed the driver's phone from its mount. The distraction lasted only moments, but it was enough. The vehicle drifted from its lane. The driver attempted to correct its path, but the corrections caused the vehicle to cross lanes and move toward a roadside barrier. Within seconds, the vehicle struck the barrier, spun, and collided with a roadside structure. Airbags deployed as the crash came to a stop. Several motorists who witnessed the collision later reported seeing the vehicle weave unexpectedly just before impact. Many initially believed the driver was dealing with a sudden emergency inside the vehicle. Emergency responders arrived quickly and found both occupants injured. The driver survived with serious injuries. Candace suffered catastrophic trauma. Investigators determined that because she had removed her seatbelt and was leaning forward between the front seats, she was thrown into the dashboard and center console when the vehicle struck the barrier. The driver remained properly restrained, allowing the seatbelt and airbags to absorb much of the crash force. Candace was out of position and unrestrained, causing her to experience far more severe injuries during the collision. A rideshare trip is one of the most ordinary parts of modern life. That is exactly why this ending feels so shocking. Something routine became deadly because one person refused to let an argument go. Candace was transported to a nearby hospital, where she was later pronounced dead from her injuries. Investigators reviewed dashcam footage, witness statements, and physical evidence from the scene. The video captured Candace reaching forward and removing the phone from the dashboard mount only seconds before the loss of control. Crash reconstruction matched the footage, and no mechanical defects were found. No evidence suggested the driver had acted negligently. The rideshare company cooperated with the investigation, and the case was closed as a fatal crash caused by passenger interference. It was January 26, 2014, at an independent donut shop in Portland, Oregon. A chilly Sunday morning kept people drifting inside for coffee before tackling their errands, while workers filled trays with fresh, sweet pastries behind the counter. The shop was filled with the smell of sugar and yeast, and the small dining area stayed busy with families, students, and neighborhood regulars just trying to get through the weekend. Across the room, Megan Claire Brislin, 35, was sitting there. She worked as a regional sales representative for a medical supply company. She spent most of her weekdays visiting clinics, negotiating contracts, and chasing monthly targets. Her friends always admired her confidence, but her co-workers knew a different side. She constantly argued over prices, demanded exceptions, and treated every single disagreement like a battle she had to win. Honestly, that attitude followed her everywhere. She believed that every business always had room to bargain and took a weird amount of pride in leaving with extra discount. Even the smallest, cheapest purchases became some kind of competition for her. She loved proving strangers wrong, especially if someone dared to suggest she was being unreasonable. To Megan, walking away quietly felt like losing, and she hated losing more than wasting money. I've known people like this, people who just can't let a single thing slide, and it's always exhausting to watch. The morning should have been totally ordinary. Megan ordered a coffee and a large box of glazed donut hole. When the cashier mentioned the price, she immediately complained that tiny pieces of dough shouldn't cost that much. A guy waiting nearby casually suggested that buying fewer would solve the problem. Instead of just laughing it off, Megan got visibly irritated and insisted the portions were so small she could swallow the whole box without any trouble. The employees tried to shut that idea down fast. The donuts had come straight from the fryer, covered in warm, sticky glaze that made them incredibly soft and tacky. One worker warned her that eating contests weren't allowed because people occasionally got hurt, and another actually suggested she just take the food home. Megan completely brushed off every warning while some customers pulled out their phones, expecting a funny but harmless video. People really will record anything these days, won't they? It's chilling to think that her final moments were being captured for someone's social media feed. She flipped the box open, grabbed more than a dozen donut holes in both hands, and shoved them into her mouth at once. People laughed as her cheeks bulged. She flashed a smug grin, determined to prove everyone wrong, then tried to swallow. The warm, sticky dough compressed into one thick mass halfway down her throat. She gagged instantly, coughing and clawing at her neck. The cashier rushed around the counter, but Megan shoved his hand away. She still refused to admit she'd made a mistake. Instead, she grabbed her large cup of fresh coffee, convinced she could wash the donuts down, and that split-second decision sealed her fate. She took several desperate gulps, but the coffee couldn't push past the partially lodged dough. Instead, the violent coughing forced the scalding liquid straight into her airway. Witnesses watched as she doubled over, spraying coffee across the floor while gasping in short, desperate breaths. Her face turned bright red, then slowly bluish as every breath became more difficult than the last. Someone called emergency services while another customer trained in first aid helped keep her airway open. By the time paramedics arrived, they managed to remove most of the dough obstruction with specialized equipment. For a brief moment, it looked like she was going to survive. She was breathing again and was rushed to the hospital in serious but stable condition. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. The hot coffee and food particles she inhaled during the choking episode severely burned and inflamed her airways. Over the next several hours, fluid built up inside her lungs, preventing enough oxygen from reaching her bloodstream. Doctors placed her on a ventilator, but her condition continued to worsen. She died later that evening from acute respiratory failure caused by aspiration of hot coffee and food into her lungs. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental. The restaurant temporarily closed for the rest of the day while investigators documented the scene, then reopened after authorities confirmed there were no safety violations or equipment failures. Staff later received additional refresher training on responding to choking emergencies. A simple choking incident became fatal because one desperate decision caused a second, far more serious injury. It was September 12, 2015, in Nashville, Tennessee. Late summer heat still hung over the city as utility crews spent the afternoon replacing aging electrical equipment at a neighborhood substation beside a busy shopping center. Temporary barriers and cones redirected pedestrians around the work zone, while bucket trucks and service vehicles moved in and out through an open-access gate. Large warning signs made it clear the area beyond was restricted to authorized personnel. Melanie Benson was 39 years old and worked as an office administrator. She hated unnecessary walking and considered even the smallest inconvenience a waste of her time. If someone told her to take the long way around or wait her turn, she'd usually start looking for a shortcut instead. Rules rarely impressed her if she couldn't immediately see the point of them. Around midday, Melanie parked at the shopping center and started walking toward the entrance, only to find the usual sidewalk blocked off by cones and temporary fencing. Utility workers were directing pedestrians along a short detour around the substation, while crews finished replacing equipment inside. It would have added maybe 2 or 3 minutes to the walk. Certain there had to be a quicker way, Melanie headed toward the open vehicle gate crews were using to move trucks and equipment in and out of the site. A worker stopped her and pointed her back toward the pedestrian detour, explaining the area was closed while electrical work was underway. Melanie immediately grew irritated, asking what they could possibly be fixing that justified blocking the sidewalk. She complained that the government was always wasting taxpayers' money on projects that looked perfectly fine, and insisted that, as a taxpayer, she had every right to walk wherever she wanted. The worker calmly explained the substation was undergoing essential electrical upgrades and repeated that the area was off limits. Most people would have accepted the short detour. Melanie walked away, but only for a moment. As another utility truck pulled through the gate, the worker stepped aside to help guide it into position. Seeing an opening, Melanie slipped around the temporary barriers and continued through the work zone toward the opposite side of the property. To Melanie, it was just a shortcut across a construction site. To everyone working there, it was an active, high-voltage hazard. One thing most people don't realize is that you don't have to touch high-voltage equipment for it to be dangerous. Around energized electrical systems, getting too close can be enough, which is exactly why utility crews take those safety boundaries so seriously. Melanie had no idea that what looked like a simple shortcut was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. The substation was divided into clearly marked work areas, with temporary orange fencing surrounding the energized equipment that remained in service while other sections were being upgraded. Several workers immediately realized where Melanie was headed and started shouting for her to stop. Before anyone could reach her, she'd already crossed the clearly marked safety boundary around the energized equipment. She kept walking, apparently convinced the workers were being overly cautious. Then, without warning, a powerful electrical arc suddenly jumped through the air. The flash was almost instantaneous, bright enough that several workers instinctively turned away as a deafening crack echoed across the site. The force of the arc threw Melanie backward onto the gravel, sending dust and loose stones into the air around her. Melanie was thrown backward onto the gravel. Everyone's first instinct was to run to her, but they couldn't. Entering the energized area would have placed the workers in the same danger, so they first had to contact the utilities control center and confirm the equipment had been completely de-energized. Those few minutes felt much longer as the the crew waited for confirmation, knowing there was nothing they could safely do until the area had been made safe. Once the power had been shut down, workers reached Melanie and began first aid until paramedics arrived. She was transported to a nearby trauma center with catastrophic electrical and blast injuries, but died a short time later despite emergency treatment. Doctors treated extensive electrical burns along with severe internal injuries caused by the arc blast. Investigators later confirmed the temporary barriers, warning signs, and pedestrian detour had all been properly installed before work began. Security footage showed Melanie walking around the barriers through the open vehicle access used by utility crews only minutes after a utility worker had directed her back toward the designated pedestrian detour. The incident was ruled an accidental death. It was June 14, 2017, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A quiet residential neighborhood was settling into the evening as many families attended school activities away from home. One property sat empty, leaving behind an object that had been the source of complaints for years. For 51-year-old Vera Cade, that object was a large trampoline. Vera worked in an administrative role and had developed a reputation among neighbors for being highly sensitive to noise and disturbances. When Vera felt someone was being inconsiderate, she rarely let the issue go. A nearby family owned a trampoline that was regularly used by neighborhood children after school and on weekends. The activity bothered Vera. She believed the trampoline was disruptive and should not be in the neighborhood at all. Over the years, she filed complaints with local authorities and repeatedly demanded that the homeowners remove it. Nothing happened. Officials found no violations, and the family had no intention of getting rid of it. As time passed, Vera became increasingly frustrated. What began as a complaint gradually turned into a personal mission. She became convinced that if nobody else was willing to solve the problem, she would have to do it herself. When June 14th arrived, Vera saw an opportunity. The homeowners had left for a school event, leaving the backyard unattended. Security footage later showed Vera entering the fenced yard, carrying a box cutter. Her plan was simple. If she damaged the trampoline badly enough, the family would have no choice but to throw it away. Most neighborhood disputes eventually fade with time. What makes this story different is that Vera wasn't looking for a compromise anymore. She wanted the problem gone. The trampoline was an older model with signs of wear from years of outdoor use. Vera climbed onto the frame and began cutting the jumping surface. The first cuts were small. Then, they became larger. As more material was removed, the remaining sections absorbed increasing amounts of tension from the springs pulling against the frame. She continued cutting. What Vera likely didn't realize was that every new cut concentrated more force into the parts that remained intact. The trampoline was no longer carrying that force evenly, placing increasing strain on a smaller number of attachment points. I think a lot of people underestimate how much force ordinary household equipment can store. Most of the time, we never notice because everything works as designed. Eventually, Vera leaned over the frame and sliced through another section near the outer edge. That was when the failure occurred. A large section of the damaged mat suddenly tore apart. As the tension released, several worn attachment points failed in rapid succession. Nearby residents later reported hearing a loud snapping sound from the yard. One spring and hook assembly broke free from the frame and recoiled toward Vera. Because she was leaning directly over the trampoline, she had almost no time to react. The metal hardware struck the front of her throat with tremendous force. The impact knocked her backward and caused catastrophic injuries to her neck and airway. She collapsed beside the trampoline and struggled to breathe. The damage made it increasingly difficult for her to get enough air as the minutes passed. With nobody else in the backyard, there was no immediate assistance available. The snapping noise eventually drew the attention of nearby residents who contacted emergency services. Responders found Vera beside the damaged trampoline and transported her to a nearby hospital. Despite treatment efforts, she died from her injuries. Investigators later reviewed security footage documenting Vera entering the property and vandalizing the trampoline before the accident occurred. The medical examiner determined that her death resulted from traumatic injuries to the neck and airway caused by recoiling trampoline hardware. The part that stays with me is that Vera spent years viewing the trampoline as a threat. In the end, the only serious injury connected to it happened because she chose to destroy it herself. Her death was officially ruled accidental, caused by blunt force trauma from a detached trampoline spring assembly during the act of vandalizing the equipment. It was June 3rd, 2014, out by Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho. The morning was chilly and damp, with a thick mist rising off the lake and boat spray leaving the public wooden dock incredibly slick. Only a few guys were out there fishing in the cold air when Norm Baxter walked down, looking for a fight. Norm was 55 and used to run a local plumbing business, but after a messy fallout with his partners, he sold it and just became incredibly bitter. His neighbors said he was totally paranoid. He started nailing homemade no trespassing signs to trees, taking photos of people's license plates, and harassing anyone who came near the dock, even though it was 100% public property. Honestly, it feels like he was just looking for reasons to be angry. That morning, 62-year-old Leonard Red Elk pulled up to fish. Leonard was a retired high school wrestling coach from Montana who spent years mentoring kids. He had a bad knee and moved slowly, but he just wanted a quiet spot to relax. The dock was slick from lake mist and boat spray, and several old steel mooring cleats along the edge were badly rusted. One near the corner had partially broken loose, leaving a jagged metal rod exposed above the wood. Leonard was fixing his bait when Norm marched down, filming him on his phone and accusing him of trespassing. Leonard calmly pointed to the county sign and tried ignoring him, but Norm kept pacing around, ranting about outsiders. Then, Norm took it way too far. He reached down, grabbed Leonard's fishing line while continuing to shout, and snapped it right in half. Leonard stood up and stepped back to keep his cool, but Norm stepped right into his space and shoved him hard in the chest. Norm wasn't done. He swung a wild punch at Leonard's head. Because of his wrestling background, Leonard's instincts instantly took over. He ducked under the punch and forcefully drove forward to stop the attack, wrapping Norm around the waist and pushing him backward across the wet dock boards instead of simply backing away. The moment Leonard drove into him, both men slid several feet across the slick wood, almost like they were on ice. Witnesses fishing nearby later said Norm's shoes completely lost traction as his heels skidded through the water and algae coating the dock surface. Leonard was still trying to control him and stop the swing when their combined weight crashed sideways toward the damaged corner section. Both men lost balance almost immediately on the slick dock. Witnesses later said Leonard still had hold of Norm when they crashed sideways near the damaged cleat. Norm's lower back and abdomen slammed onto the exposed steel anchor rod protruding beside the dock, and the metal penetrated deep into his stomach. Norm immediately went limp as the air left his lungs. Leonard immediately let go and tried pulling him away from the exposed rod while nearby fishermen rushed over with towels and life jackets. Blood spread rapidly between the dock boards and dripped directly into the water beneath them. Emergency services were called immediately, but the metal rod had punctured vital organs, causing massive, uncontrollable internal bleeding. Norm passed away at the hospital that evening. The medical examiner confirmed that the severe internal damage and blood loss from the puncture wound is what killed him. Investigators later reviewed witness statements and cell phone footage from nearby boaters. Prosecutors ultimately ruled that Leonard acted in lawful self-defense because Norm initiated the assault, and the fatal injury resulted primarily from the hazardous dock conditions rather than an intentional attempt to seriously injure him. No charges were filed against Leonard. It was March 3rd, 2019. Outside, Plano was colder than most people expected for early March, with damp air and a sharp chill still hanging around from the morning. Inside the grocery store, the checkout lanes were backed up with Sunday shoppers, half-full carts, and people quietly inching forward, waiting to pay and get home. Just a few registers back stood Jessica Laurie, 52. Jessica was a cosmetic sales director, someone who spent her life obsessed with appearances and pulling rank. According to her own daughter, Jessica had a toxic habit. She loved turning minor inconveniences into full-blown public standoffs. If a rule didn't suit her, she'd try to break it. On this particular day, Jessica finds herself in line behind Christopher and Marilou Hanks. Right beside Marilou's cart is a beautiful golden retriever in a service harness. Marilou has type 1 diabetes, and this highly trained dog is literally there to keep her alive by alerting her to dangerous blood sugar drops. The dog is being a total professional and was actually just lying quietly on the floor. but Jessica spots him and immediately loses her mind. She demands to know why there's a dog in the store, claims she's highly allergic, and orders the couple to let her cut in front of them. The cashier tries to defuse the situation, offering to open a brand new empty register just for Jessica. But Jessica doesn't want another lane. She wants a fight. As she gets louder, the manager steps in, backs up the couple, and offers to move Jessica again. She refuses. Instead, she leans over, demands proof the dog is real, and actually reaches down to grab the dog's harness. Christopher immediately slaps her hand away to protect the animal. At this point, the manager has had enough and kicks Jessica out. 2 employees escort her out, but Jessica is still screaming, filming everyone, and vowing to report them. Instead of going to her car, she paces outside like a heat-seeking missile, waiting. A few minutes later, Christopher and Marilu walk out. Jessica falls right in behind them, phone out, still harassing them. They happen to pass the covered outdoor cart return bay at the exact moment an employee is bringing in a massive, heavy train of nested shopping carts using a motorized cart pusher. Jessica is crowding the couple so aggressively that she lunges at the dog a second time. Christopher instinctively blocks her hand. It wasn't a hard shove, but Jessica is already off balance, distracted by her phone, and standing right on the painted edge of the cart lane. She stumbles backward, directly into the mouth of the cart bay. The employee spots her and slams the emergency stop, but a cart train that heavy doesn't just freeze. Even with the power cut, the long chain of metal carts keeps rolling forward under its own weight, the nested rows bunching tighter as they push into one another. Jessica tries to twist away, but there's nowhere to go. The front carts press her into the square steel end post and keep creeping forward, inch by inch, driven by the leftover momentum of everything stacked behind them. It isn't one violent hit. It's slower than that, worse than that. A grinding, unstoppable squeeze as the weight of the entire cart train compresses her pelvis and thighs against the post. She screamed once, then again, as the carts kept forcing inward before finally settling. The employee called emergency services while bystanders desperately tried to pull the carts back. Jessica is conscious, but fading fast, bleeding heavily from catastrophic internal injuries. By the time EMS arrives 6 minutes later, she's slipping away. She goes into cardiac arrest in the ambulance and dies. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental death from massive crush injuries. The force shattered her pelvis and tore major blood vessels. Police reviewed the store footage and cleared both Christopher and the employee. Christopher was just defending his wife's service dog, and the cart pusher simply couldn't stop in time. It is a deeply tragic, surreal way to die. And the wildest part? The official report noted that within the very first minute of the argument, Jessica was offered her own private checkout lane. She chose to hunt down a confrontation instead, and it ultimately cost her her life. It was July 29, 2019, at a resort hotel in Clearwater, Florida. Guests were spending the day around the pool, the beach, and the spa. Inside a quieter section of the resort was a tanning facility available to hotel guests. Over several days, one guest had become a familiar face there. Her name was Sharon Bourne, a 46-year-old real estate agent. Sharon took great pride in maintaining a dark tan throughout the year. Friends described her as someone who cared deeply about her appearance and disliked being told what she could or could not do. During her vacation, she spent a large amount of time using the tanning facility because she wanted to return home with an even darker tan. From the beginning of her stay, employees explained the recommended limits for tanning sessions. Signs posted throughout the area displayed the same information. Staff members also reminded guests to drink water, allow recovery time between sessions, and avoid excessive exposure. Sharon disagreed with those recommendations. According to employees, she argued that paying guests should be free to use the facility however they wanted. She complained that the limits were unnecessary and insisted that the risks were being exaggerated. Other guests overheard several of these conversations during the week. As the days passed, Sharon continued returning to the tanning facility. Employee records later showed a pattern of repeated use beyond recommended schedules. Staff documented multiple warnings and noted that she had been advised several times to slow down, stay hydrated, and allow her body time to recover. I've stayed at places like this before, and one thing I've noticed is that staff usually do not keep repeating the same warning unless there is a reason behind it. By the morning of July 29th, Sharon had already used the tanning facility earlier in the day. Despite that, she returned once more later that afternoon. Sharon entered one of the rooms and began another session. The equipment functioned normally. The automatic timer ended the session exactly as designed. Surveillance records later showed no indication of any equipment problem or malfunction. Investigators later determined that Sharon had been repeatedly exposing herself over multiple days while becoming increasingly dehydrated. Medical records showed she had not been consuming enough fluids despite spending extended periods in the tanning facility. The physical stress on her body had been building throughout her stay. After the session ended, Sharon remained inside the tanning area rather than leaving immediately. Surveillance footage later showed that she appeared unsteady as she exited the tanning bed and sat down in a nearby waiting area. Most emergencies happen so fast that people never see them coming. This one was different because the warning signs had been building for days. A short time later, Sharon suffered a severe medical crisis. Investigators later concluded that prolonged dehydration had caused a dangerous electrolyte imbalance. Combined with repeated heat exposure, the condition contributed to heat stroke and triggered a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. Alone in the spa area, Sharon collapsed before she could seek help. Within minutes, an employee conducting a routine walkthrough noticed that she was unresponsive and immediately called for emergency assistance. Staff members began first aid while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Emergency responders transported Sharon to a nearby hospital where doctors began intensive treatment. Although medical teams restored her heartbeat, the effects of heat stroke and the cardiac event had already caused severe complications. Despite extensive efforts by doctors, Sharon died later from those complications. The final review found no evidence of foul play. Authorities determined that repeated overexposure, dehydration, and the resulting heat-related complications were the primary factors that led to Sharon's collapse. Investigators concluded that the danger was never hidden from her. Every safeguard functioned as intended, yet none could protect her from the consequences of the choices she continued to make. It was November 12, 2018, at a family diner in Wichita, Kansas. The lunch crowd filled nearly every booth, the air thick with the smell of sizzling burgers and fresh coffee. Outside, a cool autumn breeze had people shivering in their jackets, but inside, the ovens kept things warm and comfortable. It was one of those classic spots where regulars and servers were on a first-name basis, and lunch usually drifted by without a hint of drama. But one customer always seemed to bring the storm with her. Brenda Miller was 54, a high-powered real estate agent who handled million-dollar property deals with the same relentless, steamrolling energy she used to order lunch, loudly, confidently, and with the unshakable assumption that the world would eventually bend to her will. Restaurant staff around town knew her all too well. If the coffee was a degree too cold, or the salad dressing was on the wrong side of the plate, she'd be demanding a manager before she'd even finished her first bite. She seemed to genuinely believe that complaining was the service fee she paid for being a customer. That afternoon, she ordered the French onion soup. When the bowl hit the table, steam was rolling off the melted cheese in thick, angry waves. The server, knowing who they were dealing with, gave a very clear, very specific warning. Be careful, this just came off the broiler. Brenda didn't even let it settle. She barely touched the tip of her spoon to the surface before shoving the bowl away, saying, "It isn't hot enough." The cook knew that soup was already well above standard serving temp, but Brenda threatened a one-star review on every platform she could find unless it was nuked again. After a few minutes of friction, the kitchen reluctantly shoved the bowl into the microwave for another cycle. When it came back, the server warned her twice. "I can almost see the server's frustration here. You do everything right, and some people are just determined to find trouble." The ceramic bowl was radiating heat, practically glowing. Several nearby customers heard the warning. Brenda ignored every word. Instead of letting it cool for a second, she scooped up an oversized, bubbling mouthful of broth, onions, and molten cheese and swallowed it right down. She jerked upright so violently her spoon went clattering across the table. The pain was instant. She grabbed at her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she coughed, her body clearly reacting to the sheer thermal damage. A nearby customer tried to offer her ice water, but even a tiny, tentative sip made her wince in agony. The server immediately urged her to let them call an ambulance, but Brenda refused. Embarrassed and furious, she insisted that everyone was just overreacting. It's that classic pride thing, isn't it? She'd rather suffer than admit that the staff, the people she looked down on, were actually right. After a few more minutes of arguing, she paid her bill, walked out, and drove herself home. Over the next several hours, swallowing became a nightmare. Even her own saliva felt like glass. Instead of going to the ER, she kept trying to force down water and soft foods, coughing her lungs out after every single attempt. By late that evening, her husband finally dragged her to the emergency department. Doctors found extensive, severe burns throughout her throat and upper esophagus. But the real danger was what they saw on the imaging. She had unknowingly inhaled food and saliva throughout the afternoon. The burns were so bad, they had totally fried her swallowing reflex. She was rushed to intensive care, but things only got worse overnight. The damaged lung tissue became infected, and despite everything the doctors could do with antibiotics and machines, the aspiration pneumonia turned into septic shock. Her organs just gave up, one after another. She died 48 hours after ordering a bowl of soup. The medical examiner called it an accident. In the end, the soup didn't kill her instantly. It was the chain reaction. The burns made it impossible for her throat to keep her airway clear, and her lungs just couldn't handle the influx of debris. Investigators cleared the diner completely. Security footage and witness accounts backed up the server. She had been warned multiple times, and she had flat out rejected medical help. It's hard not to look at this and see a grim sort of irony. Brenda spent her whole life demanding that others meet impossible standards, yet she couldn't accept the simplest piece of advice to just wait a few minutes. One impatient, prideful decision turned a standard lunch into a tragedy that couldn't be undone. It was August 4th, 2018, in Key Largo, Florida. Warm, clear water. The kind of visibility divers travel from all over the country to see. And a small group had booked a guided reef dive for the afternoon. Nothing advanced, just a relaxed trip out to one of the popular sites offshore. Jillian Owens was 37 years old, a financial consultant who'd flown down for a few days to unwind. She ran her whole vacation like a line item, mentally tracking what everything cost and whether she was getting her money's worth out of it. She was the type to argue a hotel room rate down over a slightly late checkout, or complain to a waiter that her appetizer took too long to justify the price. If she paid for a 2-hour dive, she wanted 2 full hours in the water, and nobody cutting things short early was going to talk her out of that math. It's a mindset that works great in a boardroom, and considerably less great 40 feet underwater. The dive started out normal, the group descending together, checking gear, following the instructor along the reef while she pointed out coral formations and a few fish weaving through the structure. About halfway through, the current started picking up, gradually at first, then enough that visibility began dropping as sediment stirred off the seafloor. The instructor recognized the shift and started signaling the group to begin their ascent early, cutting the dive short for everyone's safety. Most of the group followed without hesitation, but Jillian lingered near a formation a little longer, waving off the signal, figuring she had a few more minutes in her before she needed to surface. By the time she looked up again, the water around her had gone hazier, and there was no sign of the group's fins or bubbles anywhere she could see. What was she even planning to do down there? Negotiate with the current? By the time she turned to catch up, the group had already moved off with the current, and the drop in visibility meant she couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet in any direction. She swam toward where she thought they'd gone, but the current was pushing at an angle she hadn't accounted for. The reef features she'd been using to orient herself were gone, replaced by open water and drifting sediment in every direction. And every few minutes she checked around her, only to find herself further off course rather than closer. She checked her air gauge and realized she had less than she'd planned on, the extra swimming having burned through it faster than a normal ascent would have. Low on air and unable to locate the group, she made the decision to surface directly rather than search any longer. Her hands were shaking as she checked the gauge a second time, and her breathing had already sped up past what her remaining air could really support. From that depth, a controlled ascent should still be slow and steady to allow expanding air in the lungs to escape safely. Panicked and running low on air, Jillian bolted straight to the surface instead of making a controlled ascent. She broke the surface roughly 90 seconds later, already struggling, gasping for air, and unable to keep herself fully afloat. A crew member on the dive boat spotted her within a couple of minutes, and the boat maneuvered over to pull her aboard. At first, she was conscious but confused, complaining of chest pain, difficulty breathing, and dizziness. And within another few minutes, her breathing had become labored enough that the crew radioed ahead for emergency responders to meet them at the dock. The trip back in took close to 20 minutes, during which her condition continued to worsen. Jillian died from complications related to the uncontrolled ascent, consistent with an arterial gas embolism caused by pulmonary barotrauma. Investigators determined that the rapid ascent likely caused expanding air in her lungs to enter her bloodstream, creating air bubbles that blocked blood flow to vital organs. When her equipment and dive logs were reviewed afterward, everything lined up with what witnesses described. The instructor had signaled the early ascent, the rest of the group had followed it, and Jillian's own dive computer showed she'd surfaced well outside the safe ascent rate after several extra minutes on the reef. The case was closed as an accident tied directly to that decision. At the end of the day, the instructor was never the one keeping score. The current was, and it doesn't care what you paid for the ticket. It was August 7, 2019, in Estes Park, Colorado. A popular trailhead outside town was busy with tourists preparing for outdoor activities. Families gathered near the parking area, while horseback riding groups assembled before departing on afternoon tours. Daphne Keel wasn't a regulator, park employee, or part of the horseback riding business. Yet after months of unsuccessful complaints, she had begun treating the trailhead like it was her responsibility. The 53-year-old vacation rental owner had become known for involving herself in local disputes, especially when she believed other people were ignoring rules or creating problems. In Daphne's mind, the horseback tours never should have been operating there in the first place. She disliked seeing large horses near pedestrians and believed the tours created an unnecessary risk for visitors. Over the previous months, she had repeatedly contacted local officials and filed complaints about the operation. Each time, inspectors found no violations and allowed the business to continue. Most people would have moved on after that. Daphne doubled down. The more her complaints were dismissed, the more determined she became to prove that officials were overlooking a danger. She started confronting guides directly and frequently inserted herself into conversations with customers preparing for rides. When she arrived at the trailhead on August 7th, several tour groups were gathering near the staging area. Guides were organizing riders, checking equipment, and reviewing safety instructions before departure. Daphne immediately approached the operation. Staff explained that the business was authorized to operate there and that the horses were under control. The explanation had no effect. Instead of leaving, Daphne continued challenging the guides and criticizing the tours in front of customers. I've seen plenty of people appoint themselves as the rule enforcer. The problem is that authority doesn't magically appear just because you feel strongly about something. As the discussion continued, Daphne moved closer to the horses. The animals remained calm and stood under handler supervision, but several guides became concerned as she continued entering their space during the confrontation. One horse stood near the edge of the group. The animal weighed approximately 1,100 pounds and was being held by a guide. To avoid further conflict, staff attempted to move the horse away from the argument. Daphne followed. As the horse was repositioned, she continued directing her attention toward both the riders and the guides. The disagreement that had started several feet away was now happening within arm's reach of the animal. The horse began showing signs of uneasiness as people moved around it. Guides attempted to keep the situation under control and create more distance. Daphne continued advancing. Up to that point, the situation was still just an argument. Then, Daphne stepped toward the horse and slapped it across the face. The reaction was immediate. Startled by the strike, the horse kicked backward with both hind legs. The movement happened in less than a second. One hoof struck Daphne directly in the center of her chest and along the left side of her ribcage. The impact launched her backward several feet before she hit the compacted ground. The horse didn't know anything about complaints, permits, or arguments. It only knew that someone had just hit it. The force of the kick caused devastating injuries. Multiple ribs fractured instantly and fragments of bone damaged nearby organs. Severe internal bleeding began almost immediately. Daphne lost consciousness within moments. People nearby rushed to help while emergency services were called. Responders arrived within minutes and began treatment at the scene. Because of the extent of her injuries, she was airlifted to a regional trauma center where surgeons attempted emergency intervention. Despite those efforts, the damage to her chest and internal organs was too severe. She died from her injuries. Investigators later reviewed videos recorded by tourists and examined evidence collected at the scene. The footage consistently showed that the horse reacted only after being struck. Officials concluded that the animal's response was defensive and consistent with normal horse behavior. The irony here is hard to miss. Daphne spent months arguing that the horses were dangerous, then ignored every warning meant to keep her safe around one. The medical examiner determined that Daphne died from catastrophic blunt force injuries to the chest and internal bleeding caused by the horse's kick. Tour operations resumed after the investigation concluded, and officials found no violations by the horseback riding company. The incident was ruled a tragic accident brought on by Daphne's decision to approach and strike the animal. It was April 19, 2018, in downtown Sacramento, and it was a warm, bright afternoon at Cesar Chavez Plaza. The park was filled with the usual lunchtime crowd, office workers eating outside, buses rushing by, and retirees playing chess under the trees. It felt completely normal, but the heat and the crowds had everyone a little impatient. The guy causing the trouble was 52-year-old Hector Ruiz. He used to do maintenance work, but after getting laid off, evicted, and falling into heavy drinking, he basically started living out of public parks. Hector's neighbors said that he'd pick fights with strangers over benches, blast music, and get right in people's faces until they backed down. He was just a bully looking for a reaction. That afternoon, 74-year-old Wei Chen was sitting quietly under the trees, setting up a concrete chess table. Wei had moved to California in the 80s and spent decades teaching judo to kids. He had bad arthritis and moved slowly, but his former students always said he was the most patient, gentle guy. Hector walked into the plaza already in a bad mood after getting into an argument with a bus driver earlier on. He saw Wei at the chess table and started yelling that he was taking up too much space. Wei didn't want any trouble. He just nodded, packed up his chess pieces into a bag, and prepared to leave. But Hector wouldn't let it go. He leaned over the table and aggressively swept the remaining chess pieces across the concrete. Plastic pieces scattered under benches and rolled toward the sidewalk, while several bystanders immediately yelled at him to stop. But Wei still didn't fight back. He crouched slowly because of his arthritis, picked up only a few pieces near his shoes, then started walking away toward the sidewalk, carrying the partially open bag against his chest. But that actually triggered Hector and followed him, screaming about respect and public space while getting closer with every step. Witnesses later said Wei kept trying to angle his body away and continue walking, but Hector repeatedly moved into his path instead of letting him leave. Then, Hector suddenly reached out from behind, grabbed the front collar of Wei's lightweight jacket, and yanked him backwards so violently that the stitching near the shoulder ripped apart with a loud, tearing sound. Wei nearly lost his footing as the pull jerked him sideways toward the tables again. And that's when Wei's decades of martial arts training just automatically kicked in. He didn't punch or kick Hector. He simply reacted the way his body had been conditioned for years to react under pressure. According to the police report, Wei turned his hips slightly while trapping Hector's grabbing arm against his body to break the grip and create separation. The movement itself was quick and compact, barely looking forceful at all. But Hector had already lunged forward so aggressively that the sudden redirection of his own momentum sent him stumbling sideways toward the concrete seating area. His feet crossed awkwardly as he tried regaining balance. One hand reached toward the bench instinctively, but his shoulder clipped the edge first, throwing his upper body sideways. The side of his head then struck the concrete support beneath the table with a heavy impact that several nearby witnesses later said they clearly heard across the plaza. Hector immediately dropped onto the pavement, motionless. For a few seconds, several bystanders thought he had simply been knocked out from the fall. Then blood started running from his left ear onto the concrete while his breathing turned uneven and wet-sounding. Wei reportedly backed away several feet, still holding the torn section of his jacket while staring at Hector on the ground. Someone called 911 right away, and paramedics got him to the trauma center within 6 minutes. But the damage to his skull and brain was too severe from hitting the concrete edge. Hector passed away that evening without ever waking up. When the police watched the phone videos recorded by bystanders, it was an open and shut case. Hector was the one who attacked, and Wei was purely defending himself. The state didn't file any charges against Wei, though, sadly, his friends said he was so shaken up he stopped coming to the park altogether. It's just incredibly sad. A man lost his life, and an innocent elderly man was traumatized, all because someone wanted to start a fight over a chess table that nobody else was even using. It was November 2nd, 2013, in Louisville, Kentucky. Cold rain had been falling since midday, and guests entered the funeral home carrying umbrellas and damp coats. Inside, two grieving families shared the building, one for a visitation and one for a service, while staff hurried through the crowded, flower-lined hall. Enter Caroline Keene. She was 58, and to put it mildly, she was a control freak. For 26 years, Caroline worked as a medical billing clerk, turning medical emergencies into neat paperwork. At home, she was the family fixer, handling everyone's debts, rehab stints, and custody drama. Because of that, she was incredibly useful, but honestly, pretty exhausting to be around. When her mother passed away, Caroline's grief turned into pure resentment. She treated the funeral like just another chore she needed to micromanage, but when she arrived, her mother's chapel wasn't ready. The family before them was running late, and the staff needed just 10 minutes to clean up and reset the chairs. 10 minutes! Most of us would grab a coffee or sit down. Not Caroline. She took it as a personal insult. She started pacing the halls, visibly furious. One of the staff members warned her that the floors were slick from everyone tracking in rain, but Caroline brushed it off like it didn't matter. Then, when a woman from the earlier service came out crying, Caroline actually stopped her to complain about how long they were taking. I mean, that's the part that really gets me. You're in a funeral home surrounded by grieving families, and somehow she still made it all about her. Her cousins tried pulling her away, and even the funeral director had to step in and calm her down. Caroline wasn't having it. She shoved past him toward the chapel doors. On her way, she clipped a massive, top-heavy, rolling floral stand. Water sloshed everywhere, and the whole thing started to tilt. Staff rushed to grab it, but Caroline was already at the heavy chapel door, ripping at the handle. The door was locked from the inside. Caroline yanked it with everything she had, bracing one foot on the slick floor and leaning her whole body backward to force it open. At that exact second, the massive floral stand tipped completely over. The heavy metal urn smashed into her upper back and shoulder blades, jolting her forward and then sideways off balance. That impact was enough to break her stance. Her shoe slid on the rainwater and crushed flower petals already spread across the tile, and she went down hard. Because she was still gripping the handle, her arm jerked awkwardly as her body dropped, but the real damage came from the fall itself. She pitched backward and slammed the back of her head against the raised marble threshold at the chapel entrance. Witnesses later said the crack echoed through both chapels. The momentum twisted her body as she hit. Her neck and skull took the full force of the fall, and she collapsed flat on the stone floor, bleeding almost immediately. The chapel door swung a few inches on its closer and bumped back toward the frame, but it wasn't what killed her. The fatal injuries came from the head-first impact into the marble edge. Paramedics arrived in 7 minutes, but it was too late. Caroline never woke up. The coroner's report listed catastrophic blunt force head trauma with associated cervical spine fractures. The fall fractured the base of her skull, caused massive bleeding around the brain, and broke bones in her upper neck. Security footage and witnesses confirmed the whole thing. The staff told her to wait. Her family tried to stop her, but her temper got the best of her. No charges were filed. The funeral home did change how they secure those heavy flower stands. As for Caroline's mother, her service actually went on later that day, just as soon as the staff finished cleaning up Caroline's blood from the lobby floor. Talk about a grim twist of fate.